Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Dr. Richard Feynman was a brilliant physicist and Nobel Prize winner, and he famously said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." This was a very direct shot at consensus science. But BBC presenter Brian Cox has a different opinion. Right before the Brexit vote in 2016, Brian Cox told The Guardian, "Being anti-expert, that's the way back to the cave." And this is what The Guardian wrote. You can guess how Professor Brian Cox feels about our Brexit referendum result from his opinion of the current anti-expert mood. We met him 3 days before the referendum vote, and throughout the interview his famous perma-grin faltered only when the subject of public cynicism towards professional expertise came up. It's entirely wrong, and it's the road back to the cave. Well, that sure is interesting. I had no idea there were any Brexit experts, given that it's never happened before. Back in the days when people lived in caves, the consensus was that living in caves was the best place to be. It took a maverick to buck the consensus in order to get people out of caves. All human progress throughout history was made by people who went against the current paradigm. Also in 2016, Brian Cox debated Australian Senator Malcolm Roberts about climate on BBC TV. He argued for the absolute consensus.
This is now a clear global problem. The absolute consensus is that human action is leading to an increase in average temperatures. Absolute consensus.
Brian Cox is a very strong believer in consensus science, but Michael Crichton had a very different opinion. Crichton said, "I want to pause here and talk about this notion of consensus and the rise of what has been called consensus science. I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. When you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet because you're being had." Let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference in the real world. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it's not science. If it's science, it isn't consensus. Period. How do climate alarmists decide who is an expert? Are angry 16-year-old girls speaking to the United Nations experts? Al Gore was given the Nobel Prize for making a science fiction movie. The differences between Al Gore and Michael Crichton are that Michael Crichton's science fiction movies were good, and Michael Crichton also had a very strong background in science. Unlike Gore, Crichton never got the Nobel Prize, though. Another UN climate expert is Leo DiCaprio, who has a 450-foot diesel yacht. The reality is that academia is heavily dominated by people of left-wing political bent. A recent survey of college professors showed that the Democratic to Republican ratio was almost 12-1. The global warming consensus is a reflection of the political bent of academia. Today is the last day of 2019. Experts say we only have 1 day left to save the planet from climate catastrophe. And 30 years ago, experts said we only had until the year 2000 to save the world from climate catastrophe. According to experts, by tomorrow, Britain will have a Siberian climate, nuclear conflict, mega droughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world. In 1971, NASA's leading experts said we'd have a new ice age in 50 years. That's about a year from now. In 1970, the world's leading population experts said, the oceans will be dead as Lake Erie in less than a decade. He also said America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. In the world of academia, people get to declare themselves and their friends to be experts without ever demonstrating any actual expertise. They want to control your energy future without having any experience or expertise in energy. People become experts by delivering results. Fossil fuel companies are who made our modern civilization possible. They lifted us out of filth and squalor. They are the experts in energy, not clueless people in academia, journalism, and politics. A few days ago, Joe Biden said, "We're all dead if we don't stop using fossil fuels." But reality is that if fossil fuels became unavailable, billions of people would be dead within 2 months. We are all completely dependent on fossil fuels for heat, light, food, communication, transportation, and just about everything else in our lives. Joe Biden became dangerously deluded precisely because he listened to consensus science. I came out of the microprocessor design world. I developed my reputation as an expert by finding thousands of bugs in microprocessor designs. IBM, Apple, and Motorola gave me this plaque: the PowerPC 604 RISC microprocessor made functional by Tony Debug God Heller. In the real world, you don't get to declare yourself to be an expert. You become an expert by delivering results. Consensus science is a farce and needs to be removed from the public discourse. Brian Cox is no expert on climate, and he shouldn't pretend to be one. He relies entirely on consensus science, which, as Michael Crichton pointed out, has nothing to do with science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.